I like to think of myself as a 46-year-old millennial in terms of mindset, because I think a lot of the big benefits is that people have a real hunger to grow and continue to become lifelong learners. And I think that's inbuilt now in the modern younger workplace. And I've found that personally in my last few roles at Airbnb and Google, is working for people who actually might have less experience but have a mindset that you can really learn from. And I think I found that a real benefit.
That's Julians Persaud, Global Head of Operations for AirBnB Experiences. Jules is an exemplary growth leader. I spoke with him about what he'd learned about leading growth while working at some of the fastest growing companies of the 21st century. I'm Alison Eyring, organization psychologist, CEO, and endurance athlete. I've spent the last 25 years helping companies solve the people and organizational challenges of growth. I've worked with all types of CEOs and business leaders across the world, but it takes a special type of leader to successfully grow a business. I call them growth leaders. These leaders have an edge for growth. This allows them to drive performance today while transforming their business for tomorrow and still keeping their people energized. Growth Leaders is my new podcast where I'll show you what it takes to successfully lead business growth in conversations with some of the best growth leaders I know. We had such a great conversation that we decided to play it through in its entirety for this episode. Thanks so much for being with me today, Jules.
It's my pleasure.
Jules, tell us, where did you grow up?
I grew up in sunny London.
That must not have been a very long experience.
In the sort of 1970s, 80s. So I'm 46 years old now. But growing up in London was just an amazing experience. And as a 9-year-old, I was going on a bus to school on my own 4 miles away. You wouldn't do that these days, but London at that time was a great place to grow up.
So independent early on.
Independent early on.
And tell me, what was your first job ever?
My first job ever was a shock. I remember that first day at work.
What was it?
It's Pizza Hut. I started off as a waiter at Pizza Hut when I was 16 to sort of pay my way through college, or when I just passed on my exams. I was only doing it part-time, but it was a real shock to do an honest day's work. But I was very clumsy, and they soon realized that actually I shouldn't belong as a waiter, and they should put me in the kitchen. So I ended up actually making the pizzas at the back, and I actually eventually became a dough master, which I've still got that badge at home today somewhere. Excellent. As a Pizza Hut dough master.
So did you enjoy the dough mastery more than the pizza service?
I did. I didn't make as many tips, but I certainly ate most of the ingredients at the back. But
That's awesome. Good. So tell me a little bit about your role today.
My role today is at Airbnb, and the best way I can describe this is working on Airbnb's second album. Right? So Homes is the first album, the successful business that we built as Homes. But Airbnb has recently, in the last 2 years, moved into Experiences. So Homes is where you stay, Experiences is what you do. And this is a new way to experience cities, tours, and through guides and through the eyes of locals. And my role is to run global operations for that business. So it's a new business. It's a very fast-growing business, starting from scratch. Obviously, we've got the benefit of Airbnb and the Homes business to work with. So we've got a lot of inbuilt benefits. We've also got a lot of expectations. So that creates its own challenges.
Sometimes it's easier being the first.
It is. That's right.
Jules, tell me, what does driving growth mean to you?
Growth in itself, I think you really have to define what growth is. And for many people, growth is just about more revenue. But I think growth for me is multidimensional. Of course, it's about growing the business and the dollars. But for us in particular, growth means lots of many things. It's about growing the community, leaning in and growing towards the mission that we have as a company, and quality. So it's multidimensional, and just people tend to sort of ally growth with just pure finances. And I think particularly 21st century companies that are really kind of trying to be part of making a positive footprint in the community, growth has more meanings than just sort of revenue.
Yeah, I really like that about really defining growth in terms of what it means to the broader ecosystem and not just a financial return for the business.
That's right, yeah.
And do you think you're a growth leader? Do you identify as such?
I think everyone would aspire to be. It's probably like one of those things that you never quite get there, but the act of trying to be that is the important thing.
I think you're way too humble, because I've known you for years and I see that you have all the qualities that I would consider in a growth leader.
Oh, you know I'm British, so we can't take compliments, so we have to move on to the next question.
Fantastic. Jules, you've worked in a lot of organizations that go very fast. Can you tell me about a time when you as a leader feel that you went too fast?
When I look back to my role at Google running the Southeast Asia business, I took that role on. It's a very big opportunity. It was just post the financial crisis. Companies were getting back into investment again. And here I was charged with kind of owning and expanding the Google business in Southeast Asia, which was tremendous opportunity. And I think one of the mistakes I made when I took that role was that I tried to do too many things. Think about Southeast Asia as a region. You know, you've got some amazing countries there. You've got the opportunities in Vietnam and Indonesia, Malaysia, Cambodia. You could go anywhere and do anything. And I think the mistake I made was trying to do 20 things in the first 6 months. And I probably ended up doing 20 things really badly. And I think one of the real elements that what I learned from that was around focus. And growth is about really ultimately being very focused. And as soon as I realized that there were really three main levers to growing that business and focused on those three levers and got better at saying no and being more focused, I think the result was much better. And I think it was better for my sanity and better for the business. But that was a real lesson I learned where I was probably trying to do too much too quickly. And that taught me that lesson really around pacing, which I think we've talked about before, but actually really, really sort of came to light through that process.
And it's just such a great example of where less is more, isn't it?
Absolutely, yeah.
Well, you're talking about one of the 3 rules of intelligent restraint that I wrote about in Pacing for Growth, which is that focus overrules vision. I liken it to that, vision gets you to the starting line, but focus is what takes you across the finish line. To say a little bit more about how you drive focus as a leader.
Obviously, you have to lead by example. And I always have to challenge my own personality, which tends to be a pleasing personality. I want to do more. I get excited about new things. I get excited about initiating things. But I really had to get much more disciplined and lead by example to the team as well. Sometimes you're better defined by what you don't do than what you do. And I spent a long time getting much better and encouraging my teams to get a lot better at taking things off the table, if you like. And instead of incrementally reducing, why don't you take everything off the table and then only put back things that really matter? And I think that if you take that kind of approach, in fact, as an anecdote, I've got one colleague who at the beginning of every year, he deletes all of his meetings from his calendar and then only lets the ones that come back in, which I thought was a really good way of doing it because anything that's important will really get back on.
Yeah.
One of the big challenges we have in the modern workplace, whether you're a leader or not, is the weeds that develop in and around you, whether that's unneeded meetings or the amount of communication, you get slacks and emails and so many different ways of being distracted. And I think being very, very disciplined about your focus in your daily job and then inspiring and enabling your teams to do that is really important.
I think that's really pretty profound because we get so accustomed to adding little tiny bits and we don't understand that little by little it's just tapping all of our capacity. And your example, it reminds me of cleaning out a closet. What we want to do is like pull a little thing out here, a little thing out there, but we should just dump everything out of the closet.
It's spring cleaning.
Only put things back that we've worn, that we love, that we want to continue to use. And that would have a huge impact.
That's right. And having the discipline to do that is obviously very difficult as well.
Exactly.
It's never something you perfect. It's always something you're trying to work on.
Yeah. You said something that I thought was very interesting because you said, I'm a very pleasing person and I find it difficult to say no. One of the other rules of intelligent restraint is that strengths beat routines. The second rule of intelligent restraint is that routines beat strengths. And that's very difficult because we like to do what we do well. And so I'm curious for you, if you're a person who's pleasing, and clearly you are a very interpersonal person. You're somebody that people like to be around. They like to know you and to connect with you. So how can you be that pleasing person and also be somebody that's a little bit edgy and gets your people to say no?
I found that a continual challenge throughout my career. I think there's big benefit. As I say, a strength, if it's over-indexed, can become a challenge or a weakness, right? And I found that in particular where I do like engaging with my teams. I spend a lot of time on one-to-ones with my teams. And I think that has a big benefit, right? The obviously big benefit is the connectivity, how you can start to build the culture. The downside of that is you can get really submerged in terms of your time and not focus on some of the more strategic elements of the business. And so that has been, for me, a continual struggle. And actually, I've been really helped by going through some coaching myself. A recent coaching engagement I had where I was actually working much more on myself and my ability to create boundaries and what was reasonable and what isn't, and give myself permission to create those boundaries. And I actually had a real breakthrough through that coaching engagement. So that coaching engagement was much more about being effective at work. But what I come to realize was that if I don't look after myself first and create boundaries myself, I cannot be effective. The analogy I give is if you're on an airplane, it's kind of counterintuitive, but when the oxygen comes down, you give your oxygen to yourself first before you give it to anyone else. So if you're not in a healthy state of mind, if you don't have balance, then there's no way you're going to be able to kind of influence your role and the way you interact with others in a positive way. So I think that's really helped me a lot to make sure that I give myself permission, for example, to say, well, look, I'm used to meeting you once a week, but actually let's make it every 2 weeks. And let me create opportunities for us to connect when we need it, but let's clear that space a little bit. So I think that's something that's really worked well for me.
So you're just talking about so many things that are so interesting. One is just this idea of, in my field of psychology, people talk about self-compassion, and it's this ability to be forgiving of not being perfect. And I really love that, because I think that just saying this is a lifetime journey, this is what I'm dealing with, as opposed to, well, my strength is this way or I'm this way. What you're doing is you're then learning how to adapt and to be able to draw on other patterns of behavior to not overuse it, like the one-on-ones. I love that, but you don't overuse it. You don't just do more and more one-on-ones, but you might cut them or make them shorter. So I think that's a great example of a growth routine that you're using to make things simpler, but also to do the good things that you need for growth.
Yeah.
Now, can you think about a time when you feel that you went too slow and what happened?
Too slow? Funny enough, it's not easy to come up with I think going too fast is usually more dangerous than too slow. It's easier to speed up than slow down. The analogy again I think of is that the tortoise won the race, not the hare. I've been fortunate to work in some very high growth, fast paced companies. In fact, the last 4 companies I've worked for the last 20 years really, it's all been internet fast paced companies, either pioneering industries or growing very quickly. So I haven't actually been in many situations where we've been probably going too slowly. In fact, I think the center of gravity has always been around going too quickly.
Can you tell me about a time when you knew your business that you were responsible for was just maxed out? People couldn't go any further. And how did you know that you were at max? And what did you do about it?
If I go back to one of the earlier companies I worked for, before the first .com bust actually, in the late 1990s, I think a company called QXL I worked for, we'd busted out. I mean, our business model wasn't going anywhere. It was a hugely competitive environment we were in. We were really struggling. And I think everyone sort of looked at each other and realized it doesn't matter how hard we run and how fast we run, we're not going to be able to move forward in the way we want. And I think what happened there was inevitably some people left the company and some new people came in. But I think that's where we benefited from having some new blood come in and a big gigantic pause and a reassessment and a slowdown to speed up again later. But sometimes there's a tendency just to keep doubling down and running faster into that wall. I think in this situation, we paused, we regrouped, and we rethought our approach. And I think that was because actually we had a leader then at the time and a manager I worked for at the time, who's still a great friend of mine, who really gave us license to slow down and to think and not to panic. I think there's a tendency to over-celebrate wins and panic sometimes when things aren't going well. So a cool head was really important then, and I was lucky enough to have a manager and a leader then who showed that. So hopefully we can take some examples from him.
Through your career, you've worked in so many high-growth organizations. And yet, when I talk with people that are in really big organizations, often their challenge isn't going slow, or they're not going too fast, they're going too slow, or they're not changing quickly enough. And so I think that the rate of growth of the organization presents different challenges to you as a growth leader.
Yeah. I've gravitated towards roles and opportunities in my career or environments that are very fast-paced. And fast isn't always good. So building the breaks in, I think you've talked about before, building breaks in, and it's not a sprint, it's a marathon. But I think the sort of companies, and particularly technology companies, are guilty of this. They want you to sprint a marathon. So they have a huge time horizon and a very long-term outlook, actually. But they want the sprint all the way. And I think that can also be destructive for team members. And I think that's really important as a leader. Your responsibility is to make sure that the energy reserves of you and your team are preserved. And you're actually doing that not not just because it's the right thing to do, and it is, but because actually you're just more effective. I think you talked about how athletes need to mend and be more effective. If I'm a West Ham fan, I don't think it would help West Ham, but if they played every day, I don't think they'd get any better, right? They would soon fall apart even worse than they are. So I think it's really important that people were building in breaks, time to heal, because it actually allows them then to sprint faster later on.
You mentioned that you'd been kind of working on yourself and learning how to set boundaries. Say a little bit more about how you manage your own energy.
I have a tendency to, as many of us do in the way we communicate, get embroiled in a sort of 24-hour culture of, and I've got my current role is a global role based out of the UK. So I'm responsible for here in Asia and also in the US. And so really there's no downtime, really. You could be working 24 hours a day. And so another part of the discipline is to know when to respond and when not to, not have to be at the center of every conversation, understanding when to delegate and trust others. These are all important factors of leading in, I guess, a modern work environment where you can get, if you're not careful, you can be sitting on your email, sitting on your phone. I mean, the devices that we have allow us tremendous productivity, but they're also very counterproductive if abused. And so having that restraint, forcing that restraint on yourself, particularly where you have a global role, and there's always something to do. The days of 9-to-5 jobs are largely diminished in our area. And so you've got to create that discipline and also to create some balance in your life, if you can.
Now, you just said something that I thought was so interesting, and it was about kind of knowing when do you respond, when do you delegate. Marshall Goldsmith did the opening of intro to my book, and one thing Marshall talks about that I really love is about the need that managers have to feel that they add value. Yeah. How do you know, as a leader, when you need to add value and when you need to just stop and let people go?
Yeah, I mean, it's like this concept of leading from behind. One of the as I've got older and more experienced, one of the biggest personal satisfactions I get is really developing other people. And there's some ego attached to that as well, right? It's not just purely, hey, I've worked out now what it's like to develop other people. You really want to see the investments you put into people pay off, right? It's very personally satisfying to do that. But I think a real big benefit of that, obviously, for people to grow their careers around you, aside from that, is that you get to see up close how people can take on bigger roles and then take some load off of you. I think one of the challenges of any leadership role, it can be quite lonely. You talk to a lot of CEOs and companies. It's actually a very lonely role. And I think actually a lot of male managers develops this machismo that they're always needed. That's something that's also needs to be fought. I think what's happened for me as I've become more experienced, I've realized that actually in some ways there's less and less impact through individuals and more impact through teams. And I think particularly earlier in my career, I thought it was all about the star player turning up. And that's actually not how it works. There's a lot of benefit in the reflected glory from your team. And if you really invest in the team, you can really see that sort of shine through. And I think I've learned that over the course of my career.
Right. It seems like as you get more senior, it's not even just you have that one team, but you have a team and they have multiple teams. So it's learning how to scale yourself so that the impact that you have is felt throughout all those different groups.
And that's a challenge for managers of managers of managers. As that depth grows, that the tactics and leadership style, management style that you had previously doesn't necessarily work as well.
Right.
And so you're forced to invest more in managers and give them the tools and give them the enablers and sort of pass the torch down, essentially.
As a leader in many high-growth organizations, I'm certain that you've hired a lot of people. What do you see in an interview that suggests to you that somebody is a growth leader?
I think one of the things is people's ability to pause and to really think. People have predefined views of the world. I don't think if you think about growth leadership, to me, a lot of it's about people who are willing to grow themselves, right? And who are willing to have a growth mindset. And so one of the questions I probably let the cat out of the bag, I always ask in interviews at the end is, what's been your biggest mistake? And I think that's a really illuminating question because you get some really incredible answers. Some people are immediately trying to turn that into a benefit. Oh, well, the biggest mistake I make is I work too hard. What I'm looking for is people to give me some real genuine, authentic, vulnerable examples and to really pause and think through. And then, but more than that, not just a mistake they may have made, but it's really about what they learned from that and how they've adapted. And I think that to me is the key elements of a growth leader, someone who's willing to really adapt and someone who's willing to improve. And actually, as you get older, as you get more and more experience, what I'm looking for, particularly in more senior leaders, is people who, the more they do, the less they know, and that realization and willingness to listen to others and learn from others. I mean, I've personally, the last few jobs I've worked for, I'm working for people who are 10 years younger than me. I mean, one of my bosses here was one of the founders of the Airbnb. And I've just learned so much from working with people. There was a received wisdom 30, 40 years ago that, as you get older, there's always, you're always working for people who are older than you, right? That's gone out the window, particularly in technology. And there's so much you can learn from people who are younger than you. And I think it's a real nice mutual thing. Many of the organizations I work in have a lot of millennials. And there's this cliche that millennials are, they're people, they always want to get promoted every 6 months and they're really hard to manage. But actually, I find it really delightful because I get a lot of energy off people. And I think being a millennial is a mindset too. I like to think of myself as a 46-year-old millennial in terms of mindset, because I think a lot of the big benefits is that people have a real hunger to grow and continue to become lifelong learners. And I think that's inbuilt now in the modern younger workplace. And I found that personally in my last few roles at Airbnb and Google, is working for people who actually might have less experience, but have a mindset that you can really learn from. And I think I found that a real benefit.
Tell me a little bit about how you nurture the ability to lead growth in others.
Yeah, I think one of the things as a leader, which is also a challenge, is to be vulnerable and encourage your other team members to be vulnerable. And when I say vulnerable, it doesn't mean sort of falling apart every 10 minutes at work. I think it means being open and honest about if things aren't working, being willing to ask for help. That's hugely empowering if you can ask people for help. And not in a cynical way, not to sort of get a particular aim, but just reaching out to someone who may actually work in your team and say, look, I'm really struggling with this. Have you got any ideas? That's a healthy thing for you as a person to do. What does it say to that person you're doing that to? It says that I trust you. I want you to help me. You can add value that I can't. That builds a lot of trust. And I think if you have that sort of relationship, you've got to look to recruit those types of people who have that kind of mindset and who are going to embrace that. It just creates a climate of cooperation and collaboration, which is a hallmark of actually many technology companies.
I love what you're saying about vulnerability, because if you look at the research on trust, it would say that is a sign of trust. And so the behaviors that you're describing are such trust-building behaviors. I think that's a really energizing factor for a lot of teams.
I think with growth leaders or leadership in general, you can shoulder so much of the burden yourself. And actually, there's no reason to do that. I think if you have a high-performing team has to trust each other. And trust becomes that kind of foundation stone for effective performance. And I think the role of the leader is to create that trusted environment, which is not always easy to do, particularly when you get a lot of new people together. You've got to invest a lot up front in getting to know people. I think Airbnb does this really well with our core values interviews that we do. We're really sort of trying to understand, would these be the sort of people you'd be willing to get stuck in a lift with, or stuck at an airport waiting for a plane, and do they espouse the values that you have in the company? These are really important elements, I think, of when you're looking for people.
We've been talking a lot about your experience as a growth leader and developing others. Tell me a little bit about what you do to make sure that you are building an organization that's future ready.
I don't necessarily put experience at a premium or particular domain expertise. There's some roles where, of course, domain expertise is important. Often at Airbnb, for example, we're developing a completely new business in a different way, and nobody's done that before. So we're making this stuff up a little bit as we go along. So what's more important for me is less people who've tried to do that before, but more people who've got the right mindset. And so when you talk about future-proofing, what you're looking for is you're looking for values, shared values. You're looking for the softer skills, people who are collaborative, people who lean into working as a team versus individuals. You're looking for character, and obviously hardworking folks as well. But it's those assets that are probably more important than particular to future-proof yourself, because inevitably your business will change and adapt, and you need people who can adapt with it. And having more of a generic skill set that's applicable in all these situations is more important than someone who's got kind of fixed domain expertise.
I think that's pretty profound, because if you look at what experts in selection have been saying for years, we've always said that past behavior is the best predictor of future behavior. And I think there's a tendency for us to want people with all the right experience, as opposed to wanting people that have the ability to grow fast enough for the changes that are happening in the organization.
Not only that, if you bring in people who with the predetermined experience, they come with predefined ways of thinking sometimes. And so it doesn't mean you shouldn't hire someone from the same industry, but I've actually found some of the most successful hires I've made have come from completely different industries.
So they come in without all the preconceived notions of the way it should be.
Yeah, exactly. And I think the other benefit to any organization, we've seen this at Airbnb, we've benefited tremendously from people with other types of experience, and it really helps the DNA. It's never about bringing people for them to assimilate. You actually want to broaden the culture's a living thing. And so you want to enhance the culture by bringing in people who add something new to that culture. It becomes an organism. If your culture's still the same in 2-3 years, there's a problem. I think people are quite fearful of that. The culture's changed. Of course the culture's changed. You want it to change. You want it to develop and grow. And I think that's something we shouldn't be fearful of. But you obviously want it to grow in a positive way. And that's the most important thing.
Jules, this has been a great conversation. I appreciate you taking time to talk with me today.
Thank you.
If you'd like to learn more about Jules and Airbnb's approach to growth leadership, you can read about it in my book, Pacing for Growth: Why Intelligent Restraint Drives Long-Term Success. Don't miss the next episode of Growth Leaders, where I'll be speaking to Joachim Ackerman, who heads up global product partnerships for Google in Asia Pacific. I'm Alison Eyring. Thanks for listening. If you like what you hear, please subscribe to Growth Leaders wherever you get your podcasts. Leave a comment and a rating. We'd love to hear what you think.